Amendment 3. Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 3 and speak to the rather daunting looking number of amendments in this group. But I think the Noble Lord Winston in the first group referred to the discussion, the debate on this bill in the other place as being deficient. And I think it's interesting that last week the Institute for Government released a study stressing how much better, stronger scrutiny of bills needs to be in the other place. And I think the debate we're about to have now demonstrates, perhaps sets an example of what the other place could and should have been doing with the bill before it got to us. Because it's talking, we've already introduced this in the last group with Amendment 2 from Baroness Jones of Whitchurch, but here we're looking very broadly at the wide range of ways in which this bill might be applied, different groups of plants and animals, or not, as the case may be. And I think the words of the Noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch, there responding to the Noble Lord the Minister's comments on the earlier group, said it appeared the government is going gung-ho for all markets. And I think that's a very fair summary of what we've been presented with in this issue, which is interesting because in all of the debates and all of the presentations we've heard from DEFRA, it's all talking about this is food and farming and food security and dealing with the climate emergency. We don't see in those DEFRA press releases discussions of prettier roses or more colourful foliage on plants, yet that appears what's being proposed. And I think that demonstrates the fact that this bill, when you look into the detail of it, except for talking about marketing of food and feed, actually doesn't talk about food and farming really at all. And that's where we'll come later to a group focusing on a question of inserting a clause about public good, which is one way in which, at least indirectly, the actual claimed benefits of this bill could be inserted into it. But the single beneficiary of the bill is actually, and sometimes this does kind of sneak out, the biotech industry. It's written to support the government's industrial innovation ambitions, not to support food or farming or the food security of our population. And this is, among the many faults that were picked up by the Regulatory Policy Committee, is that it fails to understand where what it's proposing intersects with farming, food production, food businesses and consumer interests. Now, these are concerns that are also echoed in somewhat less clear language by the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee and the Constitution Committee. And I think it is worth saying, it needs to be said at some point, and this is probably the point to do it, that we actually have a great plant breeding sector in the UK, and the majority of its work is not focused on genetic engineering. It's a relatively small specialist area. And I will just mention an interesting example, Wakeland's Agroforestry, which is doing absolutely pioneering innovative work on developing races of wheat and other grains, which have built within them diversity that's built within the race of a crop that you keep using those seeds again and again and again, that has variety built into it. And that's a kind of agroecological approach to farming that sometimes the government will acknowledge is what we actually need. Now, coming to the detail of the amendments in this group, and they actually, despite the number of them, they form a very clear set of choices that are laid out before your Lordship's House. I'll begin with my Amendment 3, which very simply would exclude animals from the provisions of this bill and simply restrict it to plants. And I'm going to assume fungi. In the interest of not getting too diverted at this point, I'm not going to revise a detailed debate I had at great length in the Agriculture Bill, but fungi are not plants. And this is something that perhaps the department might like to look at before we get to report stage, or I might feel unable to avoid writing in something that would make this bill scientifically accurate. Anyway. Sorry, I will not get diverted to that. And although I will also mention, of course, that there's a great deal of discussion now about producing food in vats, which also brings up bacteria and protists, which might suggest that this bill is not as future-proofed as the government might like to claim. But anyway, my Amendment 3 excludes animals and would restrict this to plants and possibly fungi. Now, I begin with the brief words of a briefing from 15 leading animal protection organisations, including the RSPCA, the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, the Humane League, Animal Aid, Animal Defenders International and One Kind. They say that this bill, by including animals, is a backward step for animal welfare. To quote, they say, it increases the risk that animals will be regarded as things for human convenience. And, close quote, and they say that this is in contravention of the recognitions of animals as sentient beings under the new Animal Welfare Sentience Act of 2022. Now, that's a kind of philosophical approach, although I think it's interesting that the Noble Lady Baroness McIntosh of Pickering in the earlier group raised similar concerns from a briefing from the British Veterinary Association, which I haven't actually seen. But I think we also, going away from the moral arguments, very much need to look at the practical, which again was slightly raised by the Noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch in the last group. The Nuffield Council of 2016 Ethical Review of Genome Editing pointed out that if you change the genome of an animal to reduce its likelihood of it being infected with one disease, you may then be able to think we can crowd these animals much closer together in much worse conditions of animal welfare. But the point is, of course, that is opening the way up both to bad treatment of animals and also potentially to other diseases. If we look at what's happened with avian flu, which is the example which is very clearly before us at the moment, something that is believed to have started in intensive agriculture and has now spread into our wild populations and is indeed continuing to decimate our heavily crowded factory-farmed poultry. Now, I think also one of the other claims when we come to animals is, we do hear this from the government, certainly in its press releases, etc., is we'll get higher levels of productivity from the animals. But it's worth looking at what higher levels of productivity achieved from animals has already done. And there's so many accounts of this. Broiler chickens grow so quickly that their legs can't bear them, or that their hearts simply give out, not big enough to support their flesh. Hens have been bred to lay over 300 eggs a year, which means they draw on their own bone calcium to produce the eggshells. A cow, normally, to produce milk for her calf, would produce 1,000 litres of milk in a year. Now, in 10 months lactation. Now, dairy cows are bred to produce, and this is through conventional breeding, 10 times as much milk as would be natural. That contributes, unsurprisingly, to issues of lameness, mastitis, and reproductive disorders. And all of those are things that we've done with conventional breeding. Now, if we're thinking we're going to apply to animals techniques that will increase their productivity, is that really the direction in which we should be heading? I would posit that it's very clearly not. And indeed, that's something that many of the expert commentators have drawn attention to. Now, I think this is something we'll be coming back to later, but coming back to that briefing from the 15 leading animal charities, they point out that what's in the bill now in terms of animal welfare, the protections are too weak, they're very broadly drawn, and it's unclear how those protections would operate in practice. Now, I make no secret of the fact that I'm utterly not in favour of this bill at all. That's my starting position. But those who wish to actually promote and see it go through, I would put it to them that addressing the issues that Noble Lord Winston raised about public reaction to this bill would be far more favourable, I would suggest, if it only covered plants. Now, offering an alternative option here and picking up some points from the Noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch, Amendment 7, which I also put down as an alternative option, would say it's only plants or animals relating to agriculture. And I would also point out that, again, if you look at what the government is talking about, the Eustace press release, the George Eustace press release that I referred to earlier, said quote, "We can breed crops that are more nutritious, resistant to pests and diseases, more productive and more beneficial to the environment, helping farmers and reducing impacts on the environment." That's relating to agriculture. That's not those terribly decorative roses or those lovely foliages for the hedge. The DEFRA Chief Scientific Advisor, quoted in that same press release, said the purpose of the bill is to build better crops. That's how this is all being sold. Now, I neglected to mention earlier, and I should have done, that I wanted to thank the Noble Ladies Baroness Hayman, Jones of Whitchurch and Bakewell of Hardington Mandeville for supporting my Amendment 3. And I also want to offer copious thanks to the Noble Ladies Hayman and Bakewell, who have, from the amendments from 15 onwards, actually brought in a huge number of consequential amendments to my Amendment 3, dealing with the bill at a level of detail which I'm afraid I simply didn't have the capacity to manage. So I very sincerely thank the Noble Ladies for that. And I will just finally note that the other alternative options brought in here is, in the name of Noble Lady Baroness Parmenter and Baroness Hayman, Amendment 4 would say only farmed animals. Amendment, as also in slightly different form, would Amendment 6. And Amendment 5, I think a very important one in the name of the Noble Lady Baroness Hayman of Ulloch, explicitly excludes companion animals. And I was talking about what we've done to productive animals like dairy cows. And if you think of what traditional breeding has done to, for example, some breeds of dog, and the kind of lives that conventional breeding has given to some types of dog, I think I have very little doubt that the British public would think that gene editing of companion animals should be absolutely excluded from this bill.